You're not on the list." The words landed cold and final, just inches from Naomi Carter's face as she stood at the entrance of a sprawling estate glowing under strings of golden lights. The kind of place where even the air felt expensive, where black SUVs lined the driveway, and laughter carried like it belonged to people who had never once been told no. And yet here she was, a bridesmaid, clutching her invitation with trembling fingers while the security guard's eyes scanned her not like a guest, but like a question he had already decided the answer to. Her heels, 2 inches, worn thin from miles of city sidewalks, shifted against the stone as she forced a breath, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm with the bridal party," she said, pointing past him where silhouettes of perfectly dressed women moved like a synchronized dream. But he didn't move, didn't blink, just gave a tight, rehearsed smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm going to need you to step aside, ma'am." And for a second, just 1 second, Naomi felt it. That familiar heat rising in her chest. The quiet humiliation that never shouted but always stayed. The kind that made you question whether you were wrong for even showing up, whether your name was ever really meant to be on that list at all. Inside, a violin swelled, the ceremony already starting, time slipping, and she thought about the bride, her college roommate, the one who had begged her to stand beside her today, who had said, "I don't care what anyone thinks, I want you there." And something in Naomi refused to let this moment be taken from her. Not like this. Not because someone decided she didn't look like she belonged. So she straightened her back, lifted her chin, and stepped forward, not loud, not aggressive, just certain, brushing past the hesitation in his stance like it wasn't real, like she wasn't asking permission anymore. And this time, he didn't stop her. By the time Naomi pushed through the tall glass doors, the ceremony was already in motion, soft white petals lining the aisle, rows of guests seated in tailored suits and silk dresses, every head turning at once as the doors whispered shut behind her. And suddenly the room felt too quiet, too aware, like her lateness had become the centerpiece of a moment that was supposed to be perfect, her dress slightly wrinkled from the rush, one strap slipping just enough to remind her she hadn't had time to fix it. And somewhere in the front, the bride's eyes flickered toward her, just for a second, before returning to the vows. But it was enough to tell Naomi to keep moving, to take her place, to pretend like she hadn't just fought her way inside. Whispers followed her steps down the aisle, soft but sharp. "She's late." Who was that? Was she supposed to be here? And Naomi kept her eyes forward, each step measured, controlled, even as she felt the subtle shift of her right heel, the faint crack she had noticed running across it earlier now threatening to give way completely. But she didn't stop, couldn't stop, not when she was this close. And then, just as she reached the front, just as she slipped into line beside the other bridesmaids who looked at her with a mix of confusion and polite discomfort, she felt it. A gaze. Steady, unflinching, not like the others, not laced with judgment or curiosity, but something else entirely, something that made her glance up despite herself. And there he was, seated near the front, a man in a perfectly cut charcoal suit, posture relaxed but presence unmistakable, his blue eyes fixed on her like he had been waiting for her to arrive even when she didn't know she was being watched. And for a fraction of a second, the noise faded, the whispers, the music, the weight of every look in the room, all of it blurred into the background as Naomi met his gaze. And there was no question in his eyes, no doubt, just a quiet, undeniable recognition, as if he saw past the lateness, past the tension, straight to the part of her that refused to shrink, that refused to apologize for taking up space. Julian Whitmore didn't know her name yet, didn't know why she had been stopped outside, didn't know that one of her heels was seconds away from breaking. But in that moment, watching her stand there, composed in the middle of a room that wasn't built for her, he knew one thing with a certainty that surprised even him. This woman, the one everyone else was questioning, was the most real thing he had seen all night. The music swelled again, soft and elegant, as if nothing had happened, as if every whisper that followed Naomi Carter down that aisle had already been folded neatly into silence. But the weight of those looks did not disappear. It lingered in the way one bridesmaid subtly adjusted her position to create distance, in the way a woman in the second row leaned toward her companion and murmured something behind a gloved hand. In the way the air itself seemed to tighten every time Naomi shifted her stance. Careful, controlled, pretending that her right heel was not seconds away from giving out completely. She kept her shoulders squared, her chin lifted, eyes forward, but inside, her heartbeat had not slowed. It echoed in her ears like a reminder that she had forced her way into a space that had tried to reject her, and now she had to survive it, minute by minute, breath by breath, until the ceremony ended. Across the aisle, Julian Whitmore had not looked away, not once. And it was not curiosity that held his attention, not the kind that fed on spectacle or difference, but something quieter, more unsettling, because he recognized that look on her face, the one she tried to hide beneath composure. He had seen it before in boardrooms where people underestimated him before they knew his name, in rooms where respect was given based on perception rather than truth, and yet what struck him most was not that she had been judged, but that she refused to bend under it. When the officiant spoke, when vows were exchanged, when the guests leaned in with softened smiles and practiced emotion, Julian found himself distracted, not by the ceremony, but by the tension written into the way Naomi stood, the slight shift of her weight, the almost imperceptible wince she masked every time that damaged heel pressed against the polished floor. And then it happened, so small that most people would have missed it, the faint snap of pressure giving way, the subtle tilt of her posture as the heel finally cracked just enough to throw off her balance, and for a split second, her hand moved, instinctively reaching for stability before she caught herself, before she forced stillness back into place. But Julian saw it. He saw the moment she almost faltered and chose not to fall, and something in him tightened, not out of pity, but out of respect. The ceremony concluded with applause, light and polite, guests rising from their seats, conversations blooming instantly as if rehearsed, and Naomi exhaled slowly, the first real breath she had taken since stepping inside. But there was no relief waiting for her, only the transition into the reception, where scrutiny would be less subtle and expectations far less forgiving. She stepped carefully, adjusting her gait to compensate for the broken heel, each movement calculated, refusing to let anyone see the struggle beneath the surface. And as the crowd began to flow toward the open terrace where champagne flutes shimmered under soft lighting, she felt it again, that presence, that gaze, closer now. You are going to hurt yourself if you keep pretending that shoe is fine. The voice was calm, low, carrying none of the edge she had come to expect in this space. And when Naomi turned, she found him standing just behind her, close enough to speak quietly, far enough to give her space, his expression composed but his eyes unmistakably aware, not of her mistake, not of her lateness, but of her effort to hold everything together. For a moment, she said nothing, weighing the tone, the intention, searching for the hidden judgment that usually followed words like that. But there was none, just observation, and something else she could not quite name. I am fine, she replied, automatic. The kind of answer built from years of needing to be fine even when she was not. But his gaze did not shift, did not challenge. It simply remained, steady, as if he was giving her the option to tell the truth without forcing it from her. You almost fell, he said gently, not accusing, just stating a fact. And something about the way he said it made the moment feel less like exposure and more like acknowledgement. And Naomi let out a small breath she did not realize she was holding. Glancing down at the heel she had been trying to ignore, the crack now impossible to hide. It is nothing, she said again, softer this time, less defensive, more tired, and Julian nodded once, as if accepting her answer even if he did not fully believe it, then reached toward a nearby table and picked up a folded linen napkin, offering it to her without hesitation. Wrap it around the heel, just enough to keep it stable until you can sit down, he said, his voice practical, unassuming, as though helping her was the most natural thing in the world. And for a second, Naomi hesitated, not because she did not need the help, but because she was not used to receiving it without a cost attached, without a shift in power, without being made to feel smaller for needing it. But there was no performance in him, no audience, just a quiet solution placed in her hands. She took the napkin, her fingers brushing his briefly, and there it was again, that unexpected sense of grounding, of being seen without being reduced. And as she crouched slightly to secure the fabric around the heel, Julian turned just enough to block the view from passing guests, subtle, deliberate, shielding her from eyes that had already decided too much about her. When she stood again, steadier now, she met his gaze properly for the first time, really looked at him, taking in the tailored suit, the effortless confidence, the way people nearby seemed to shift their attention toward him even when he was not speaking. And something in her tightened, a realization forming that this man did not just belong here. He defined the space in ways she could not yet see. "Thank you," she said quietly, sincerity slipping through despite her caution, and Julian gave a small nod, his lips curving just enough to suggest warmth without overstepping. "You are welcome," he replied. And as the crowd continued to move around them, as laughter rose and glasses clinked, as the night unfolded into something glittering and carefully curated, neither of them knew yet that this moment, this small exchange between a broken heel and a folded napkin, had already shifted the course of everything that was about to happen. The terrace opened into a world that felt even more curated than the ceremony itself. Soft golden lights strung above polished stone, waiters moving like clockwork with trays of champagne, laughter rising in carefully measured tones, and Naomi Carter stepped into it all with a steadiness she had built piece by piece over years of being underestimated. The linen wrapped around her heel holding just enough to keep her moving, but not enough to forget the pressure beneath it, and she told herself that all she had to do was get through the night, smile when expected, stand where she was told, and leave without becoming a story whispered over cocktails. Julian Whitmore remained just a few steps behind her, not hovering, not imposing, but present in a way that felt intentional, as if he had already decided that whatever happened next, he was not going to let her face it alone, and yet he said nothing, giving her space to navigate the room on her own terms, watching the way she adjusted, the way she chose where to stand, how she held herself when a group of guests glanced at her just a second too long, how she refused to shrink even when the space seemed designed to make her feel smaller. Naomi reached for a glass of water instead of champagne, her fingers steady now, and turned slightly to take in the view beyond the terrace. The city stretching out in the distance, lights scattered like a promise that there was more than this moment, more than this room, and for a second, she let herself breathe, until a voice cut in behind her, smooth, polite, but edged with something sharper beneath the surface. "I do not believe we have met," and when she turned, the woman standing there wore elegance like armor, her dress perfectly tailored, her smile flawless, her eyes calculating in a way that made it clear this was not a casual introduction. "I am Margaret Whitmore," she continued, extending a hand that Naomi noticed did not quite reach all the way forward, as if offering just enough courtesy to maintain appearances without fully committing to it, and Naomi took it anyway, her grip firm, respectful. "Naomi Carter," she replied, her voice calm, even the kind of calm that came from knowing exactly how these conversations tended to go. Margaret's gaze flickered briefly to the linen wrapped around Naomi's heel, then back to her face, the smallest pause, almost imperceptible, but deliberate enough to be felt. "You must be with the bridal party," she said, the slight hesitation before the last words carrying more meaning than the sentence itself, and Naomi nodded once, choosing not to fill the silence with explanations, choosing not to justify her presence in a space that had already questioned it. But before Margaret could continue, another voice entered, lighter, amused. "Julian has been impossible to find all evening, and here you are." And Naomi did not need to turn to know who it was. She felt it in the shift of energy behind her, in the way Margaret's posture straightened just a fraction, in the way the conversation suddenly became less about her and more about him. Julian stepped forward with the same composed ease he had carried from the moment she first saw him. But now, standing beside him, Naomi could see the difference. The way people adjusted when he entered their space. The way attention bent toward him without effort, and Margaret's expression softened instantly, the edge gone, replaced with something warmer, more practiced. "We were just getting acquainted," Margaret said, her tone now smooth and welcoming. And Julian's gaze moved from Margaret to Naomi, not lingering, not possessive, just present. "Good," he replied simply, then added, "Naomi just saved the ceremony from being predictable," and the corner of his mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile, but enough to shift the tone of the moment. Margaret let out a soft laugh. Polite, measured, but her eyes returned to Naomi with a new layer of scrutiny, as if reassessing, recalculating where she fit in this carefully structured world. Well, unpredictability can be refreshing, she said, though the pause before the last word lingered just long enough to suggest it was not entirely welcome, and Naomi felt it again, that quiet pressure, that subtle push to remind her that no matter how composed she appeared, she was still being evaluated before the conversation could settle into something sharper. A waiter approached, offering a tray of champagne, and Margaret accepted a glass. Julian declined, and Naomi shook her head, keeping her water, the small choice feeling like an anchor in a moment that threatened to drift into something less comfortable. You will have to excuse me, Margaret said after a moment, her attention already shifting elsewhere. There are people I need to speak with, and with that, she moved away, her presence dissolving back into the flow of the event as seamlessly as it had arrived. The silence that followed was not heavy, not awkward, but aware, and Naomi let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, glancing briefly toward Julian. I am guessing that was not just any guest, she said, her tone light, but edged with curiosity, and Julian tilted his head slightly, considering her. No, he answered, his voice calm. She is not. And something in the simplicity of that response made Naomi look at him more closely, the pieces beginning to align in a way that shifted the ground beneath her feet, not because of who he was, but because of what that meant for everything that had already happened between them. And for the first time since she stepped into the estate, she wondered if the space she had fought to enter was not just unfamiliar, but deeply connected to the man now standing beside her, a man who had chosen, without hesitation, to stand in that unfamiliar space with her. You still think I am just a guest, do you not? Julian's voice was quiet, almost amused, but there was something beneath it that made Naomi Carter pause before answering, her fingers tightening slightly around the glass in her hand as the noise of the terrace continued around them, laughter rising, glasses clinking, conversations overlapping in a way that made everything feel both alive and distant at the same time. She turned toward him fully now, studying his expression with a new awareness, the pieces she had been ignoring starting to fall into place, the way people looked at him, the way Margaret had shifted the moment he arrived, the way the space itself seemed to adjust around him as if it had been built with him in mind. I think, Naomi said slowly, choosing her words with care, that you are not just anything. And Julian let out a soft breath that almost sounded like a laugh, not mocking, not dismissive, but understanding, as if he recognized the shift happening in her perception and did not rush to define it for her. That is a fair answer, he replied, his gaze steady, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The silence between them filled not with discomfort, but with something more deliberate, a space where truth could exist without being forced. Across the terrace, a group of men in tailored suits began to move closer, their conversation carrying just enough volume to suggest importance, and as they approached, one of them nodded toward Julian with a familiarity that was not casual but expected. We have been looking for you, the man said, his tone respectful, almost deferential, and Naomi felt it then, the final confirmation settling into place, not through an announcement, not through a title, but through the way authority naturally followed him, the way attention gathered without effort. Julian acknowledged them with a slight incline of his head, but he did not step away immediately, did not shift his focus entirely. Instead he glanced back at Naomi, as if weighing something, as if deciding whether to leave or stay, and that small hesitation told her more than any introduction could have. You should go, Naomi said quietly, not as a dismissal, but as an understanding, her voice calm, controlled, even as something inside her tightened, not because she wanted him to stay, but because she already knew what staying would mean, what it would imply about her place in his world. Julian studied her for a second longer, then nodded once. I will find you later, he said, not as a question, not as a promise, but as something in between, something that assumed continuity where there was none yet defined. And before she could respond, he turned toward the men waiting for him, stepping into their circle with a presence that immediately shifted the dynamic of the group, their posture adjusting, their tone lowering slightly, their attention centering around him as if it had always belonged there. Naomi watched for a moment, just long enough to see the difference. The way he spoke now, measured, confident, the way others listened, not interrupting, not challenging, and she realized that whatever she had sensed earlier was only a fraction of the truth, that he was not just part of this world. He was one of the people who shaped it. And the realization did not come with awe, did not come with admiration, but with a quiet, steady clarity that changed the ground beneath her feet. She turned away before the thought could settle too deeply, moving toward the far edge of the terrace where the lights dimmed slightly and the city stretched out in full view. The night air cooler here, less filtered, less controlled, and she leaned lightly against the railing, careful of her balance, letting the noise behind her fade into something distant. She had been in rooms like this before, not as a guest, not as someone invited to stay, but as someone passing through, someone tolerated for the duration of an event, and she knew the pattern, the way attention could shift from curiosity to dismissal in seconds, the way a single moment could define how you were remembered long after you left. And she refused to let that happen tonight, refused to become the story people told about the girl who did not belong. Behind her, the music changed, softer now, signaling the transition into the next part of the evening, and footsteps approached, not rushed, not hesitant, just steady, familiar in a way that made her glance back before she even realized she was doing it. And there he was again, Julian, having stepped away from the circle of men with an ease that suggested he could leave any conversation he chose, his attention returning to her without hesitation, as if the world he had just been part of was something he could step in and out of at will. "I did not want you to disappear," he said simply, stopping a few feet away, giving her the same space he had from the beginning, and Naomi let out a small breath, something between a laugh and a release. "I am not the kind of person people usually look for in places like this," she replied, her tone light but honest, and Julian's expression shifted slightly, not in disagreement, but in recognition of the truth beneath her words. "That might be their mistake," he said, and the way he said it, without emphasis, without performance, made it land differently, not as flattery, not as an attempt to impress, but as a statement he believed without needing her to accept it. Naomi held his gaze for a moment longer, then looked away toward the city again, the lights stretching out endlessly, and for the first time since she stepped into the estate, she felt something unfamiliar, not discomfort, not pressure, but the beginning of a question she had not planned to ask, a question about what happens when someone from a world that was never meant for you chooses to step toward you anyway, not to change you, not to fix you, but simply to stand beside you, and whether that kind of choice could ever be real, or if it was just another moment that would fade the second the night ended. Do you ever get tired of pretending you belong in places that never planned for you? Naomi Carter did not look at him when she asked the question, her eyes still fixed on the city beyond the terrace. But her voice carried something deeper now, not defensive, not fragile, just honest in a way that did not ask for sympathy. Julian Whitmore paused before answering, not because he did not understand the question, but because he did, more than she might expect, and when he finally spoke, his tone was quieter than before, stripped of the effortless confidence he carried in front of others. "I do not pretend," he said, then added after a beat, "but I know what it feels like to be seen the wrong way." And that answer made Naomi turn slightly, not fully, just enough to study him again, searching for the gap between what he said and what he was, because from where she stood, everything about him belonged here, every detail, every movement, every interaction, and yet something in his voice suggested there was more beneath the surface, something that did not fit as easily as it seemed. "That must be a very different kind of wrong," she replied, not sharp, not accusing, just real, and Julian accepted it with a small nod, not arguing, not trying to bridge the difference with empty words, because he knew there were distances that could not be explained away in a single conversation. Behind them, the energy of the reception shifted again as music softened into a slow rhythm, couples beginning to move toward the dance floor, the newlyweds stepping into the center under a wash of warm light, and applause followed as if on cue, drawing attention away from the edges of the terrace and back toward the heart of the event. But Naomi did not move, and neither did Julian. Both of them suspended just outside the moment everyone else seemed to be participating in, You should be over there, Naomi said after a moment, nodding slightly toward the dance floor, where people who clearly knew him were already glancing around, expecting him to join, and Julian followed her gaze briefly before looking back at her. I am exactly where I want to be, he replied, and there was no hesitation in it. No performance. Just a simple statement that landed heavier than it should have, because it shifted something unspoken between them, something that made Naomi's chest tighten in a way she did not expect. Before she could respond, a voice cut through the air again, louder this time, less polished, carrying a tone that did not bother to hide its assumptions. Julian, you are disappearing on us tonight. And Naomi turned to see a man approaching, his confidence bordering on careless, his smile wide, but edged with something that felt less welcoming and more evaluative. His gaze flickering to Naomi for just a fraction too long before returning to Julian. And who is this? He asked, not rude enough to be called out, not kind enough to be genuine, the kind of question that placed her in a position. Without directly stating it, Julian's expression did not change, but something in his posture did, a subtle shift that made it clear the tone of the conversation had already been set. This is Naomi Carter, he said evenly. No hesitation, no softening. Just her name, complete and unapologetic, and for a moment, the man seemed to consider that, his smile tightening slightly as if recalibrating. Of course, he said, though it was clear he had no idea who she was. And how do you know the bride? The question came quickly, almost too quickly, and Naomi recognized it for what it was, not curiosity, but verification, a quiet attempt to confirm her place in the room, and she met his gaze without flinching. We went to school together, she answered, her voice steady, leaving no space for further questioning. But the man's eyes flickered again, this time downward, taking in the linen wrapped around her heel, the slight imperfection in an otherwise polished setting, and there it was again. That pause, that almost invisible shift that carried more meaning than any words. Julian stepped slightly closer then, not enough to draw attention, but enough to change the dynamic, to close the space that had been used to evaluate her. And when he spoke again, his tone remained calm, but there was a firmness now, a quiet boundary being set without raising his voice. We were just heading inside, he said, not asking, not waiting for agreement, and the man nodded quickly, stepping back, the conversation already dissolving before it could deepen. Of course, I will see you later, he said, his attention returning fully to Julian, as if Naomi had already faded from relevance in his mind. As they moved away, Naomi felt the shift again, the way the moment had been redirected, the way the conversation had been cut short before. It could become something sharper, and she let out a slow breath, not relief exactly, but recognition, because she had seen that pattern before. The way people like him asked questions not to know, but to categorize, to decide where you fit before you even had a chance to speak for yourself. You did not have to do that, she said quietly once they were out of earshot, her tone neutral, but Julian shook his head slightly. I did, he replied, his voice steady, because I know exactly where that conversation was going. And Naomi glanced at him, really looked at him again, and for the first time, she saw not just the man who belonged in this world, but the one who understood its edges, who recognized the lines others pretended did not exist, and chose, deliberately, which side of them he stood on. The music swelled again, louder now, pulling the crowd closer together, and Naomi shifted her weight carefully, testing the stability of the wrapped heel, the fabric holding for now, but not forever, and she knew that eventually, she would have to leave, step out of this space before it demanded more than she was willing to give. But as she stood there beside him, watching the night unfold in layers of light and sound, she realized something she had not expected, that for the first time since she arrived, she was not thinking about how quickly she could leave, but about how long she might be able to stay before the world around them tried to pull them back into the roles it had already decided they should play. Tell me something that has nothing to do with this place, Julian said, his voice quieter now as the music swelled behind them and the terrace filled with movement, couples drifting toward the dance floor, laughter rising in ways that felt distant compared to the stillness between them. And Naomi Carter glanced at him with a hint of surprise, not because of the question itself, but because of how rare it was to be asked something that did not immediately try to define her by where she stood. or how she fit. She let out a small breath, shifting her weight carefully as the linen held her heel together just enough to keep her grounded. And for a moment she hesitated, not out of reluctance, but because she was deciding how much of herself to offer in a space that had not exactly welcomed her. "I draw," she said finally, her voice softer than before, less guarded, and Julian tilted his head slightly, as if the answer mattered more than it should. "What do you draw?" he asked, and there was no rush in it, no impatience. Just a steady curiosity that felt unfamiliar in a world where most questions were designed to measure rather than understand. Naomi looked out at the city again, the lights stretching endlessly, and a faint smile touched her lips, the first real one of the night. "People," she said. "Mostly people who do not think anyone is paying attention to them." And something in that answer landed differently. Something that made Julian's gaze sharpen just slightly, not in intensity, but in focus, as if he suddenly realized that the woman standing beside him did not just move through the world. She observed it, captured it, understood it in ways most people never took the time to consider. "That sounds honest," he said after a moment, and Naomi let out a quiet laugh, the sound light but grounded. "It is," she replied. "And sometimes honesty is not what people want to see." And Julian nodded, understanding that more than he could easily explain, because he had spent years navigating rooms where truth was often less valuable than perception, where the right image mattered more than the right intention. The music shifted again, slower now, drawing more people. Onto the floor, and a few feet away, someone called Julian's name once more, not insistent, but expectant, the kind of call that assumed he would respond, and for a second, he did not move, his attention still on Naomi, as if weighing something he had not yet decided. "You should go," she said again, this time with a slight smile, softer than before, less about pushing him away and more about acknowledging the reality of where they stood. And Julian exhaled slowly, a hint of reluctance in the movement. "Come with me," he said, the words simple, but carrying more weight than the tone suggested, and Naomi's smile faded just enough to reveal the thought behind it, the calculation, the awareness of what that invitation meant. Not just a dance, not just a moment, but a step into a space where every movement would be seen, interpreted, remembered. "I do not think that is a good idea," she replied gently, not dismissing him, not rejecting the offer outright, but setting a boundary that came from understanding rather than fear. And Julian studied her for a moment, then nodded, accepting it without argument, without trying to persuade her otherwise, because he recognized the difference between an invitation and a decision. "Then I will stay here," he said, and Naomi blinked slightly, caught off guard. Something neither had expected when the night began. Something that felt less like coincidence, and more like a moment that had been building from the second she stepped through those doors, late, unwelcome, and entirely unwilling to disappear. "Take it off." Julian's voice was calm, low enough that it did not carry beyond the space between them. But the words still caught Naomi Carter off guard, her brows lifting slightly as she turned toward him, a small, incredulous smile forming before she could stop it. "That is not exactly a normal suggestion," she replied, her tone light, but edged with caution, and Julian's expression shifted just enough to show he understood how it sounded. "The shoe," he clarified, glancing briefly at the linen wrapped around her heel, "not everything else." And that earned a quiet laugh from her, the kind that slipped out before she could filter it, breaking through the tension that had followed her since the moment she arrived. For a second, the world around them softened, the music fading into the background, the pressure easing just enough for something real to exist between them, and Naomi shook her head slightly, still smiling. "You are very direct," she said, and Julian's response came just as steady. "Only when it matters." And there was no arrogance in it, no attempt to impress, just a clarity that felt different from the polished conversations happening all around them. Naomi hesitated, then shifted her weight carefully, glancing toward the quieter hallway he had noticed earlier, the one that led away from the crowd, away from the eyes that had followed her all evening. And without saying anything more, she took a small step in that direction, not fully committing, just enough to signal she was considering it, and Julian followed at a respectful distance, not leading, not guiding, just walking beside her as they moved away from the terrace and into the softer lighting of the interior. The hallway was quieter, the sounds of the reception muffled by distance, the air cooler, less saturated with expectation. And Naomi exhaled slowly as they reached a small alcove near a set of tall windows. The city lights still visible but softened by the glass. And for the first time all night, she felt like she could stand without being watched. She leaned lightly against the wall, then bent carefully, slipping off the damaged heel. With a controlled movement, the relief immediate but subtle, and when she straightened, holding the shoe in her hand, she let out a breath that carried more weight than she intended. "That is better," she admitted, and Julian nodded, his gaze not lingering on the act itself, not making it something it was not, just acknowledging the practicality of the moment. "Let me see it," he said, extending his hand slightly. And Naomi hesitated for half a second before handing over the shoe, her fingers brushing his again, that same grounding sensation returning in a way she could not quite explain. Julian turned the heel over in his hand, examining the crack with a focus that felt almost out of place for something so small, but he did not treat it like an inconvenience, did not dismiss it as trivial. Instead, he studied it as if it mattered because it affected her, and after a moment, he looked up. "It is worse than it looks," he said, and Naomi let out a soft laugh. "That is usually how these things go," she replied, her tone lighter now, the edge of the evening finally beginning to fade. Julian glanced around the hallway, then reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, pulling out a small, sleek card holder, and from it, a thin strip of something metallic, compact and precise, and Naomi watched with quiet curiosity as he adjusted the piece against the heel, not fixing it permanently, but stabilizing it just enough to hold for the rest of the night, his movements careful, deliberate, as if he had done this before, though she could not imagine when or why. "You carry tools in your jacket?" she asked, her voice touched with amusement, and Julian allowed the faintest hint of a smile. "You learn to be prepared," he replied, not elaborating, not turning it into a story, just stating it as fact, and when he handed the shoe back to her, the heel felt steadier, not perfect, but enough. Naomi slipped it on again, testing her weight carefully, and for the first time since she arrived, she felt balanced, not just physically, but in a way that reached deeper, because this moment, this quiet exchange in a hallway no one else noticed, had nothing to do with status or perception, nothing to do with where she fit or how she was seen. It was simply two people solving a problem together without making it something it was not. She looked up at him then, really looked, the question she had been holding forming more clearly now. "You do not do things halfway, do you?" she said, and Julian met her gaze without hesitation. "No," he answered, and there was something in that word, something steady and unshakable, that made Naomi realize this was not just about a broken heel, not just about a moment of kindness. It was about the way he moved through the world, the way he chose to show up, and for a second, she felt the edge of something unfamiliar, something that could become more if she let it, and that realization was both grounding and dangerous. From the terrace, the music swelled again, louder now, calling people back into the center of the night, and Naomi glanced toward the sound, then back at Julian, the space between them no longer defined by distance, but by something quieter, something that had shifted, without either of them naming it. And as they stood there, just outside the reach of the world that had tried to define them both in different ways, Naomi understood that whatever happened next, this moment had already changed the course of the night in a way neither of them could undo. "You are not what I expected," Naomi Carter said quietly, the words slipping out before she could filter them. And for a moment she almost took them back, not because they were wrong, but because they revealed more than she intended. But Julian Whitmore did not react with surprise or offense. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if considering the statement rather than questioning it. "What did you expect?" he asked, his voice calm, open, and Naomi let out a small breath, glancing toward the window where the city lights blurred into something distant, easier to look at than the truth forming in front of her. "Someone who would not notice a broken heel," she replied after a second, her tone light, but grounded in something real, and Julian's expression shifted just enough to show he understood what she meant, not just the surface of it, but the implication beneath, the idea that people like him were supposed to exist at a distance, untouched by the small, human details that defined moments like this. That sounds like a very specific expectation, he said, and Naomi allowed herself a faint smile. It is a learned one, she answered, her voice steady, and for a moment, the silence between them deepened, not awkward, not empty, but filled with everything neither of them needed to say out loud. From the terrace, the music softened again, transitioning into something slower, more intimate, and voices drifted through the hallway, laughter mixing with the rhythm, reminding them that the night was still moving forward, still pulling people back into its carefully designed flow, but neither of them stepped toward it yet. You could stay here, Julian said after a moment, his tone thoughtful, not persuasive, just offering the possibility. No one would notice. And Naomi shook her head slightly, the movement small but certain. That is not true, she replied, her gaze returning to him. People notice everything in places like this. They just choose what matters, and Julian nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in that, the selective attention that shaped how people were seen and remembered. Then what do you want them to notice? He asked, and the question landed differently than the others had, not probing, not strategic, just direct in a way that made Naomi pause, because it was not about where she fit, but how she chose to exist within it. She looked at him for a long second, weighing the answer, then said quietly, that I am here because I was meant to be, not because I slipped through a door that was not opened for me. And there it was, the line she had been holding all night, the truth beneath every step she had taken since the moment she was stopped at the entrance. And Julian's gaze held hers, steady, unflinching, as if he understood that this was not about the event, not about the people, but about something much deeper, something that shaped the way she moved through every room she entered. Then let them notice that, he said simply, and there was no hesitation in it, no suggestion that she needed to change anything about herself to make that happen, just a quiet confidence that she already carried everything she needed. Naomi felt something shift again, something subtle but undeniable, because this was not how these conversations usually went, not how people like him usually responded, and for a second, she wondered if she had misread him, if there was something she had not yet seen. But before the thought could settle, a voice echoed down the hallway, sharper this time, carrying a note of urgency that cut through the softness of the moment. Julian, they need you inside. And Naomi turned slightly to see a woman approaching, her expression composed but her pace deliberate, the kind of presence that suggested responsibility, expectation, and something that did not wait. Julian's posture shifted just a fraction, not stiffening, not retreating, but aligning with something he had been holding at the edge of the night. And Naomi saw it clearly now, the weight of whatever role he carried in this world, the one that had been hinted at but never fully named. I will be there in a moment, he said, his voice calm but firm, and the woman nodded, her gaze flickering briefly to Naomi before returning to him, a silent acknowledgement of something she did not question out loud. Then, she turned and walked back toward the terrace, leaving the air between them changed. Naomi exhaled slowly, the question she had been avoiding now impossible to ignore, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter, more direct. You should go, she said, not because she wanted him to leave, but because she understood that whatever he was being called to was not optional, not something that could be set aside indefinitely. Julian looked at her for a second longer, then nodded once, but this time there was something different in his expression, something more resolved, as if a decision had been made that went beyond the immediate moment. I will find you, he said again, but this time it sounded less like a possibility and more like a certainty, and Naomi felt that shift, the way the words settled into something heavier, something that carried forward beyond the hallway, beyond the night itself. She held his gaze for a second longer, then gave a small nod, not agreeing, not dismissing, just acknowledging the space between what was said and what might actually happen. And as Julian turned and walked back toward the light, toward the world that had been waiting for him all along, Naomi remained where she was, standing in the quiet edge of a moment that had already changed more than she expected, watching as he stepped back into a space that seemed to belong to him completely. And for the first time since she arrived, she realized that the question was no longer whether she belonged here, but whether she was willing to stay long enough to find out what it meant to be seen by someone who did. The moment Julian Whitmore disappeared back into the glow of the reception, The space around Naomi Carter seemed to shift again, not because anything had changed physically, but because the quiet buffer he had created around her was gone, and in its place, the awareness of the room returned, sharper now, more defined, like stepping out from behind a door into a spotlight you did not ask for. She exhaled slowly, adjusting her posture as she stepped back toward the terrace, the repaired heel, holding steady beneath her. Each step a reminder of the brief moment of balance she had just experienced and the uncertainty waiting beyond it. And as she re-entered the open space, the noise of the event wrapped around her again. Laughter, music, conversations layered over one another in a way that felt both inviting and distant at the same time. She moved carefully along the edge of the crowd, not hiding, not shrinking, but choosing her position with intention, the way she always did in places that required awareness just to exist comfortably. And for a few minutes, it worked, the rhythm of the night carrying her forward without interruption, until it did not. There you are. The voice came from her left, smooth but carrying a familiarity she did not immediately recognize, and when Naomi turned, she found herself facing one of the women from earlier, not Margaret, but someone who had stood close enough to her to share the same air of quiet evaluation, her smile polite, but her eyes sharp, measuring. You disappeared after the ceremony. The woman continued, her tone light but deliberate, and Naomi gave a small nod, keeping her expression neutral. I needed a moment, she replied, her voice calm, and the woman's smile widened slightly, as if that answer confirmed something she had already suspected. Of course, she said, glancing briefly at Naomi's heel before returning her gaze upward. These events can be overwhelming. And the pause before the last word carried just enough weight to suggest it was not meant kindly, not entirely. Naomi felt it, that familiar undercurrent, the suggestion that she did not belong, that she was out of place in ways that needed to be gently acknowledged rather than openly stated, and she held the woman's gaze without flinching. Only if you let them be, she replied, her tone even, and for a second, the woman's expression flickered, not expecting resistance, not expecting composure, and then it smoothed again, practiced and precise. You must be very close to the bride, the woman continued, her voice softer now, but no less intentional, and Naomi nodded once. We are, she said, offering nothing more, refusing to expand, refusing to explain, but the woman's eyes lingered, searching for something else, something that would place Naomi into a category she could understand. And how long have you known Julian? The question came casually, almost as an afterthought, but it landed differently, sharper, more pointed, and Naomi felt the shift immediately, the way the conversation had moved. From polite curiosity into something more deliberate, something that was no longer about her connection to the bride, but about her proximity to him. For a brief second, Naomi considered her answer, not because she needed to think about the truth, but because she understood the implications behind it. The way any response could be interpreted, reshaped, used to reinforce whatever assumption had already been made. And she chose carefully. We met tonight, she said simply, her voice steady, and the woman's smile tightened just slightly, the answer not aligning with whatever narrative she had been constructing. That is interesting, she said, drawing out the last word just enough to suggest it was more than a casual observation, and Naomi held her gaze, unbothered on the surface, even as she recognized the pattern, the way curiosity could shift into judgment without ever raising its voice. Before the moment could stretch further, before the conversation could sharpen into something less subtle, a ripple moved through the crowd, a shift in attention that pulled eyes toward the center of the terrace, and Naomi followed the movement instinctively, her gaze landing on Julian as he stepped forward, not onto the dance floor, but just beside it, his presence enough to draw focus without demanding it. And the room responded, conversations lowering, attention redirecting, as if an unspoken cue had been given. The woman beside Naomi straightened slightly, her attention moving fully away. Now, and Naomi watched as Julian spoke briefly with the newlyweds, his expression warm but composed, the kind of interaction that balanced familiarity with distance. And then, as if sensing it, his gaze lifted, scanning the crowd, not aimlessly, not casually, but with purpose, and when his eyes found hers across the terrace, the connection was immediate, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just clear, intentional. And for a second, everything else seemed to fall away again. Naomi felt it, that same pull, that same unexpected grounding. But this time it came with something else, something sharper, the awareness of being seen in a space where visibility had always come with conditions, and she did not look away, did not break the moment. Even as the woman beside her shifted slightly, following the direction of Julian's gaze, and then back to Naomi, the pieces beginning to align in a way that changed the tone of everything that had been said before. Well, the woman murmured softly, her voice no longer carrying the same lightness. That explains a few things. And Naomi did not respond, did not give her the satisfaction of confirming or denying anything, because the truth was no longer something that needed to be explained. It was something unfolding in real time, visible to anyone who chose to see it. Across the terrace, Julian took a step forward, then another, moving through the crowd with the same quiet authority he had carried all night. People shifting naturally to make space, conversations pausing, attention following, and Naomi stood still, her posture steady, her gaze fixed, knowing without needing to be told that whatever happened next would not go unnoticed, not by the people watching, not by the woman beside her, and not by herself, because this was no longer just about a conversation in a hallway or a moment of kindness. This was about what it meant to be chosen, publicly, in a space that had already decided where you were supposed to stand. The moment Julian Whitmore stepped fully into the open, the atmosphere shifted in a way that could not be ignored, not because he demanded attention, but because attention followed him naturally, like something practiced, expected, and as he moved through the crowd toward Naomi Carter, conversations softened, glances turned, and the subtle undercurrent of the evening rose to the surface, no longer hidden behind polite smiles and quiet assumptions. Naomi felt it before he even reached her, the weight of being seen not just by him, but by everyone else who had been watching, measuring, deciding, and she held her ground, her posture steady, her gaze unwavering, even as the woman beside her took a small step back, creating space as if anticipating what was about to unfold. Julian stopped just in front of her, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough to keep the moment grounded, and for a second, neither of them said anything, the silence carrying more meaning than any introduction could have, until he spoke, his tone calm, but carrying a clarity that cut through the noise around them. "I was looking for you." And the simplicity of the statement landed differently now, not private, not contained, but visible to everyone within reach. And Naomi felt the shift immediately, the way the words changed the way she was being seen, the way they redefined her presence in a space that had questioned it. From the start, "I did not go far," she replied, her voice steady, matching his calm, and Julian nodded slightly, as if that answer mattered more than it should, then glanced briefly at her heel, the repaired structure holding firm beneath her, and a faint hint of satisfaction crossed his expression, subtle but real, before his attention returned fully to her. "Good," he said, and there was something in that word, something that suggested more than approval, more than acknowledgement, as if her staying, her choosing to remain in this space, meant something to him in a way that extended beyond the moment. Around them, the quiet observation had turned into something more defined, not loud, not confrontational, but present in the way people paused just a second longer when passing by, in the way conversations shifted direction to accommodate what was happening in front of them, and Naomi was aware of all of it, every glance, every pause, every unspoken question, but she did not move, did not retreat, because this was no longer just about her place in the room. It was about what it meant to stand in it without apology. "They are expecting you," she said after a moment, her tone softer now, but carrying the same understanding as before, and Julian followed her gaze briefly toward the center of the terrace where attention still lingered, then looked back at her, his expression unchanged. "They can wait," he replied, and the words were not dismissive, not careless, just certain, and that certainty landed in a way that made the space between them feel different again, heavier, more defined. Naomi let out a small breath, something between disbelief and recognition, because this was not how these moments usually played out, not in rooms like this. not with people like him. And yet here he was, choosing to stand in front of her, in full view, without hesitation, without explanation. "You are making this very noticeable," she said quietly, a hint of a smile touching her lips, and Julian's response came just as steady. "It already was," he said, and Naomi knew he was right, that the moment had been building since she walked through those doors, since every glance, every whisper, every assumption had been layered into the night, and now it was simply being brought into the open, before she could respond. The music shifted again, slower, more deliberate, and a murmur moved through the crowd as people began to gather closer to the dance floor. The expectation clear, the next part of the evening unfolding as it had been planned, and Julian glanced toward it briefly, then back at Naomi, and this time, when he spoke, there was no hesitation, no space for interpretation. "Dance with me," he said, the words simple, direct, and the weight of them immediate. Naomi felt it then, the full impact of the invitation, not just a dance, not just a moment, but a step into the center of everything she had been standing on the edge of all night, a choice that would not go unnoticed, that would not be easily forgotten, and for a second, the room seemed to narrow, the noise fading, the expectations pressing in, and she looked at him, really looked, searching for anything that suggested doubt, hesitation, anything that would make this easier to refuse. But there was none, just the same steady presence she had seen from the beginning. "You do not make small decisions, do you?" she asked softly, and Julian's answer came without pause. "Not when they matter." And the consistency of it, the way he did not shift, did not adjust to make the moment easier, made something inside her settle, not completely, not without question, but enough to recognize that this was not about being placed into his world. It was about being invited into it on her own terms. Naomi glanced once more at the space around them, at the people watching, at the woman who had questioned her now standing just a few feet away, her expression unreadable, and then back at Julian, and without another word, she placed her hand in his, the movement deliberate, steady, not rushed, not hesitant, and as he guided her toward the center of the terrace, the space seemed to shift around them, conversations quieting, attention focusing, the unspoken becoming visible in a way that could not be undone, and Naomi felt it, not as pressure, not as fear, but as something else entirely, something that felt like stepping into a moment she had not planned for, but one she was no longer willing to walk away from. The moment Naomi Carter's hand settled into Julian Whitmore's, the entire rhythm of the night shifted, not abruptly, not dramatically, but in a way that rippled outward, subtle and undeniable, as if the room itself had taken a breath and was now holding it, watching, waiting, and as he led her onto the dance floor, the space opened around them, couples stepping aside just enough, conversations lowering, attention focusing in a way that did not need to be announced to be understood. Naomi felt every step, not just beneath her feet where the repaired heel held steady, but in the weight of the moment itself, the awareness that this was no longer something happening at the edge of the room, but at its center, visible, undeniable, and yet she did not hesitate, did not pull back, because something in her had already decided that if she was going to stand here, she would do it fully, without apology. Julian's hand remained steady in hers, his other resting lightly at her waist, not controlling, not guiding beyond what was necessary, just present, grounding, and as the music wrapped around them, slow and deliberate, they moved together in a rhythm that felt unexpectedly natural, not practiced, not performed, but real in a way that cut through everything else happening around them. For a moment, the noise faded again, the weight of the room dissolving into something distant, and Naomi found herself focusing on the details she could control, the movement of her steps, the steadiness of her breath, the way Julian's gaze held hers without wavering, without shifting to the people watching, as if the rest of the world had already been set aside. "You are not thinking about them anymore," he said quietly, his voice low enough that it belonged only to the space between them, and Naomi let out a small breath, something between a laugh and a realization. "I am trying not to," she replied, her tone honest, and Julian's expression softened just slightly, not in sympathy, but in recognition. "You are succeeding," he said, and there was no exaggeration in it, no attempt to reassure her beyond what was true, and that made it land differently, made it feel real in a way that words often did not. Around them, the reactions were less subtle now, not loud, not confrontational, but present in the way people paused longer than necessary, in the way conversations shifted to include quiet observations, in the way Margaret Whitmore stood just at the edge of the floor, her posture composed, her expression unreadable, watching not with surprise, but with a level of attention that suggested she understood exactly what this moment meant, not just for Julian, but for the room itself. Naomi felt it, the shift in perception, the way she was no longer being questioned in the same way, but was now being evaluated through a different lens, one that came with its own weight, its own expectations, and for a second, the awareness threatened to pull her back into the same cycle she had been fighting all night. But Julian's hand remained steady, his presence unchanged, and she chose, deliberately, to stay in the moment instead of retreating from it. "This is going to be talked about," she said quietly, her voice steady, not fearful, just aware, and Julian's response came without hesitation. "Then let them talk," he said, his tone calm, certain. And there was something in that certainty that made Naomi look at him differently, not just as the man who belonged here, but as the one who understood what it meant to challenge the expectations that came with it. The music slowed further, the space between movements stretching, giving them more time, more room to exist within the moment, and Naomi felt something shift again, something deeper, because this was no longer just about being seen. It was about being understood, about standing in a space that had tried to define her and choosing instead to define herself within it. "You realize this changes things," she said after a moment, her voice softer now, and Julian met her gaze without hesitation. "It already has," he replied, and there was no doubt in it. No hesitation, just a quiet acknowledgement of something that had been building from the moment they met. Naomi held his gaze, searching for any sign that this was temporary, that it would fade the moment the music stopped, but there was none, just the same steady presence she had come to recognize, and for a second, she allowed herself to believe it, not completely, not without question, but enough to stay where she was, enough to continue moving forward instead of stepping back. As the song began to draw to a close, the final notes lingering in the air, the applause that followed was softer than before, less about performance and more about the moment itself, and as Julian's hand remained in hers, as the space around them began to shift back into motion, Naomi realized that whatever happened next, whatever came after this night, this moment could not be undone, because it had already rewritten the way she was seen, not just by the people around her, but by herself, and as she stepped back slightly, creating just enough space to breathe, to think, to process, she knew that the hardest part was not going to be what happened in this room, but what came after. When the music stopped, when the lights dimmed, when the world outside this carefully constructed space returned, and she would have to decide whether this was just a moment, or the beginning of something she was willing to fight for. The applause faded slowly, like the last echo of something that had already begun to change the shape of the night. And as Naomi Carter stepped back from Julian Whitmore, the space between them did not feel like distance. It felt like a pause, a moment suspended between what had just happened and what was about to follow. And for a second, neither of them moved, as if both understood that stepping away would mean returning to a world that had already been altered by their choice. Around them, the crowd began to shift again, conversations restarting, laughter rising cautiously at first, and then more freely. But the attention did not disappear completely. It lingered in glances, in quiet exchanges, in the way people looked at Naomi now, not with the same subtle dismissal from earlier, but with something more complicated, something that mixed curiosity, surprise, and a recognition they had not offered her before. Naomi felt it all, every shift, every glance. But this time it did not press against her the same way. It did not force her to shrink or adjust, because something inside her had already settled, not fully, not without question, but enough to stand without feeling like she had to prove anything to anyone in the room. "You handled that better than most people would," Julian said quietly, his voice carrying the same calm steadiness that had grounded her from the beginning, and Naomi let out a small breath, a hint of a smile returning as she shook her head slightly. Most people are not used to walking into a room where they are not Expected to succeed, she replied, her tone light, but rooted in something real, and Julian's gaze held hers, not challenging, not dismissing, just present, as if he understood more than he needed to say. You were expected, he said simply, and Naomi paused at that, the words landing differently than anything else he had said, not because they erased what had happened earlier, but because they reframed it in a way she had not considered, and for a moment, she did not respond, not because she disagreed, but because she was deciding whether she was ready to accept it, before she could answer. The shift in the room became more defined, not just in the way people moved, but in the way attention began to gather again, this time not around the dance floor, but around a small raised platform near the center of the terrace, where a microphone had been set, the subtle cue that something more formal was about to take place. Naomi followed the movement instinctively, her gaze settling on the platform as a man stepped forward, his presence confident, his tone practiced, the kind of voice that carried easily across a room without needing to be raised. And as he began to speak, welcoming guests, acknowledging the couple, setting the tone for the next part of the evening, Naomi felt the shift again. The return of structure, of expectation, of roles that had been briefly set aside. Julian's posture changed just slightly beside her, not rigid, not distant, but aligned with something that had been waiting, something that required his attention in a way that could not be ignored indefinitely. And Naomi noticed it, the subtle adjustment, the way his focus shifted just enough to acknowledge the responsibilities that came with his place in this world. This is where it becomes official, he said, quietly, almost to himself, and Naomi glanced at him, a small question forming in her expression, and for the first time since they met, Julian did not immediately explain, did not fill the silence with context, and that hesitation told her more than words could have. Official, she asked, her voice calm but curious, and Julian met her gaze, his expression steady, but carrying a weight that had not been there before. The part where everyone is reminded who they are supposed to be, he replied. And the honesty in it, the lack of performance, made Naomi understand that whatever was about to happen was not just another part of the evening. It was something that would define how the rest of the night unfolded. On the platform, the speaker continued, his voice weaving through acknowledgments and introductions, and then, almost seamlessly, the tone shifted, the words becoming more pointed, more directed, and Naomi felt it before she fully processed it, the way the attention in the room began to move, not randomly, not casually, but with purpose, with intention, and as the speaker paused, glancing toward Julian with a small, knowing smile, the connection became clear, and of course, the man said, his voice carrying easily across the terrace, we would not be here without the support of someone who has become more than just a guest tonight. And the words hung in the air for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, just enough to draw attention, just enough to shift the focus completely, and Naomi felt it, the weight of the moment returning, sharper now, more defined, because this was no longer just about a dance, or a conversation, or a quiet choice made in a hallway. This was about how those choices were seen, how they were interpreted, how they were placed into the structure of a world that did not easily bend. Julian's hand moved slightly at his side, not reaching for hers, not pulling away, just steady, and Naomi stood beside him, her posture unchanged, her gaze forward, as the room waited, as the speaker's words began to shape the next moment. And for the first time since she stepped into the estate, she understood that whatever came next would not just test how she was seen, it would test how she chose to remain. Julian Whitmore. The speaker's voice carried clearly across the terrace, smooth and practiced, but now unmistakably directed. The man who made this entire celebration possible, and the words settled over the crowd like a final piece clicking into place, confirming what had only been hinted at all night. And Naomi Carter felt it instantly, the shift in energy, the quiet realization spreading through the room as people turned, not just toward Julian, but toward her, standing beside him. No longer an unnoticed presence, no longer someone easily dismissed. For a brief second, the world narrowed, the sounds around her softening into something distant as the truth settled fully into view, not through whispers or assumptions, but through declaration. And Naomi understood now, completely, that Julian was not just part of this world, He was one of the people who defined it, who shaped it, who made moments like this possible, and the weight of that realization pressed against everything that had happened between them, every word, every glance, every choice. Beside her, Julian did not react with surprise, did not shift under the attention. He simply stepped forward when the speaker gestured toward him, his movements calm, composed, the kind of ease that came from standing in moments like this countless times before. And yet, before he moved fully away, his gaze flickered back to Naomi, just for a fraction of a second, a silent acknowledgement that held more meaning than any introduction could have. And then he turned, stepping toward the platform as the room responded with polite applause, the sound building, filling the space, reinforcing the structure Naomi had felt, but not fully seen until now. She remained where she was, her posture steady, her gaze forward, even as the attention lingered, even as the shift in perception settled more deeply into the room. Because this was the moment where everything could have unraveled, where the difference between them could have been made obvious in a way that separated them completely. And yet, something inside her refused to step back, refused to retreat into the role that had been expected of her from the beginning. On the platform, Julian accepted the microphone with a nod, his presence commanding without effort. And when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm clarity she had heard all night, but now it reached further, extending beyond the space between them into the entire room. "Tonight is not about me," he began, the words simple, direct, and the crowd responded with a soft murmur of agreement. But Naomi noticed the way his gaze moved, not scanning aimlessly, but searching, finding her again across the distance, holding there just long enough to make it clear that what he said next would not be separated from the moment they had shared. "It is about the people who show up when it matters," he continued, his tone steady. And something in the phrasing shifted the room, not dramatically, but enough to make people listen differently, to make them consider something beyond the surface of the event. And Naomi felt it, the connection forming, the way his words began to carry more than just polite acknowledgement. "Sometimes," he said after a brief pause, "the most important presence in a room is not the one everyone expects, but the one that refuses to leave when it would be easier to walk away." And the words settled into the space between them, not directed openly, not calling her name, but clear enough that Naomi felt them land, felt the meaning behind them. And for a moment, the noise of the room faded again, replaced by something quieter, something more personal. The applause that followed was softer this time, less automatic, more thoughtful, and as Julian stepped back from the microphone, returning it to the speaker with a nod, the structure of the evening resumed, the flow of the event continuing as if nothing had changed. And yet everything had. Naomi stood still for a second longer, letting the moment settle, letting the weight of it move through her, without forcing it into something it was not. And then she exhaled slowly, her shoulders easing just slightly, not in relief, but in recognition, because this was not about proving anything to anyone in the room anymore. It was about understanding what had already been set into motion. As Julian stepped down from the platform, the crowd parted again, conversations resuming around him, people reaching out, acknowledging him. But his path did not waver, his direction clear, and Naomi felt it before he reached her. The same steady presence returning, the same quiet certainty that had followed him from the beginning. When he stopped in front of her again, the space between them felt different, not defined by distance or hesitation, but by everything that had already been said without needing to be repeated. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to clarify, nothing left to prove, only the choice of what came next. "You stayed," he said finally, his voice low, carrying the same calm certainty, and Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. "So did you," she replied, her tone steady, and a faint smile touched Julian's expression, not wide, not performative, just real. Around them, the night continued, the music rising again, the conversations blending into something seamless, but the moment between them remained, grounded, unchanged by the movement around it. And as Naomi stood there, no longer at the edge, no longer questioning her place, she realized that this was not about fitting into a world that had not made space for her. It was about standing in it as she was and letting the right person meet her there, not above, not below, but beside her. And for the first time since she stepped through those doors, she did not feel like she had arrived late. She felt like she had arrived exactly when she was supposed to.